So Professor Fleming in Boston, it's a great honor to be able to have this discussion with you. You spoke to the Kent Archaeological Society some weeks ago, but I'm afraid although we were talking about a period popularly known as the Dark Ages, but a term that you don't use, as far as the Kent Archaeological Society goes, Teams brings its own particular darkness, which we are avoiding this time by using Zoom. What I thought would be good is at the beginning, as someone who's obviously studied this particular very important but controversial period between the end of what we call Roman Britain and then obviously the kind of beginning of the early medieval period. How would you describe what happened over the first sort of 1 or 2 centuries of that period? So, I mean, would you kind of think of this as being a period of great disruption economically that meant that there was a huge influx of, kind of new settlers? Or would you think of it as a much more complex process with kind of uneven impact across Britain, or do you use some other kind of model?
Well, I think the second model that you proposed is closer to the one that I would see. I mean, in terms of what I see this period looking like, I think one of the problems in thinking about it is that we have this nice break between the Roman period and the early medieval period that we think of that happens in 400 or 410 or 450, you pick your own date, but somewhere in there. But if you look at the evidence, actually things start unwinding in Britain earlier than that. And so in the 350s and 60s, you can begin to see pressures on the Roman state and the Roman economy in Britain. And then those, the problems that are beginning to happen accelerate over time. And I think things are pretty difficult for a couple of 100 years for people at the top or people who would have been at the top of society. But I do think what happens is there's a kind of flattening. I think that the world that's created as Rome withdraws and the Roman economy collapses is that it's much harder for people to get a lot of resources and then store those resources and know what to do with those resources to actively give themselves more power in the world. And so I think that hierarchy flattens out quite a bit. And so I think in terms of disruption, it's very disruptive for people who had a lot of connections with the Roman state. But I think if you're a sheep farmer in Somerset, I think things might be better for you. And so it might not be such a bad period for you. You're not having to pay taxes. It's harder for elites to get things out of you, so you're probably not paying as much of what you're actually producing. So I think it's the kind of golden age of the subsistence farmer. And I think subsistence farming is something that peasants like, right? It's not a bad thing if you're a peasant, it's a good thing. So.
Now, in your Penguin history of this period, sort of the fall of Roman Britain, I think it came out about 10, 12 years ago. You have a very haunting description of what happened when the Roman period ended, of kind of the archaeological record showing sort of, like in Canterbury, kind of everything kind of stopped. And there's this sort of layer of earth where everything presumably, just kind of deteriorated. So, if we were sort of standing in Canterbury in, I don't know, sort of November 450. So we would be standing in a place a bit like the sort of, that great kind of poem, The Ruin. We'd be standing in a place that was presumably partly inhabited. I mean, what would it have been like to be in that place at that time, do you think?
Well, I think it would have been a kind of difficult place to be in because there had been a lot of infrastructure in a place like Canterbury. And once it was no longer maintained, it began to fall apart, right? And so buildings collapsing, roofs collapsing, squatters starting fires in, in uninhabited buildings. And we can see this in a lot of, places in America. So there were some very haunting pictures taken of some of the great buildings of Detroit from the early 20th century, and they had all fallen apart and they were all ruinous and they had all been abandoned. And so you could kind of see hints of the glory but you could also see that there was nothing but decline and decay in those buildings. So I think that I think there would have been a lot of wreckage and a lot of ruin, and it's not a very easy place to live. And why would people choose to live in a place like that? I mean, there's certain resources that you can have. I mean, if you want to scavenge, you can find things in sites like that. But it's much easier to move out from these decayed urban places and move to the countryside, I think. So I think that I think it's quite likely that most of these places were mostly abandoned. It doesn't mean that there aren't a few people living in the ruins, but I think it's just much easier to live outside the walls than inside the walls of a former Roman settlement.
So in your newest book, you talk about the sort of material issues of this period, and you also describe what attitudes towards Roman monuments may have been like. And you give it, if I understand it correctly, a kind of different sort of interpretation, because it's like these may well have been symbols of oppression and, kind of highly politicized for people who lived, kind of in the decades after the Roman administration ended. So, I mean, presumably one of the reasons why, kind of Roman monuments kind of were taken apart and used in building new kind of structures, was it because of this, kind of political, this idea that this was a symbol of oppression? Or, I mean, and how is this like a hypothesis, or do you think that there's, kind of quite strong evidence that there was this antagonism or feelings of, complex feelings towards the former Roman period?
Well, I think that there's no doubt that in the immediate generations after the withdrawal of the Roman state, that people would have had quite complex feelings about the Roman state. And again, it would really depend on your social position, I think, and where you stood in the hierarchy. And I do think that people who had been oppressed within the villa system and within the Roman state's taxation system probably weren't all that sad to see the Roman villa in their neighborhood abandoned. But as elites began forming again in Britain, and as people come into Britain from other parts of the former Roman world, in particular churchmen, they understand the value of those buildings and they understand the prestige of building in stone. So they're the ones that are taking apart these buildings and then reconfiguring them into new buildings. And that, I think, is a political statement saying, we're like them, we're as good as the Romans, look at us, we're building these buildings. And so the people who are taking the buildings apart, ironically, aren't the people who probably were never very fond of those buildings, but the people who really, really love the idea of the Roman past.
Now, we're going to have to hit this issue at some point, so we may as well hit it now. Anglo Saxon. There's a lively debate, and you're probably maybe aware of it, probably happily keep out of it. But I mean, it's noticeable. You definitely use the term early medieval, and you sort of, and I suppose, what is, I mean, do you feel that term Anglo-Saxon is, I mean, presumably it's unhelpful. So, kind of how do you feel that term should be used now? Because of course it's so kind of encoded in courses and literature. I mean, do you think we should just basically boot it out? It's just become too politicized, or do you think it has a kind of role, but it's much more, you have to define it very carefully?
Well, I think it has no role at all in the 5th and 6th centuries. I think before the formation of ideas about Englishness, I think it does nothing but obscure what's happening. Because what it suggests to people is that people are coming over from the continent, as if English people are coming over from the continent with their fully formed culture and arriving in England and then conquering England or whatever they're supposed to be doing. And so I think that, I mean, that's factually wrong. And so I think it's extremely unhelpful in these early centuries. People in later centuries, like King Alfred, begin to use the term, right? And so it has a kind of contemporary meaning in the 9th, 10th, 11th centuries. And so I think one can make an argument that it's useful to use then, when the people we're studying actually used it themselves and sometimes describe themselves that way. Although I think I probably wouldn't use it just because I think there's a lot of baggage associated with the word. But I do think in talking about the very early centuries of the Middle Ages as Anglo Saxon, it is just wrong. And I think that most people who grow up and become Anglo Saxons or think of themselves as English in the 7th century had grandparents or great grandparents who were British. So I think the making of the English people is an act of ethnogenesis. And when we use the term Anglo-Saxon, it seems like we're talking about genetics.
Yeah. Well, so I mean, sort of an indirect way to kind of come to that. The striking thing about your work is the way that you bridge archaeology and history. And I mean, it's sort of strange, isn't it? That bridge is all too often not kind of crossed. And I think one of the points you make in, your latest book is how actually, the documentation, of course, is not great for the period you're talking about, barely exists.
Right.
But archaeology has really, exploded, and you kind of refer to many really great discoveries. So, kind of how do you marry the historic kind of, the historians tend to sort of be in their ghetto and the archaeologists are in their ghetto. Right. Have you found in your work that you're seeing signs that those bridges are being crossed, or do you feel that there's still too much division?
Well, I mean, I think that there have always been people who worked on both sides of the divide. And I'm one of a bunch of historians, I think, who have become more archaeological in our approach. I think archaeologists have been more willing to read historians than the other way around traditionally. But I also think that a lot of times archaeologists are working with older historical paradigms that they might have learned when they were undergraduates that are no longer current. And so the marriage hasn't been perfect on either side. I think the sort of up and coming generation of medievalists are much more open to material culture than people have been in the past. And I do hope that there will be more people who are willing to work on both sides of the divide. But I think it's really a matter of training. I mean, we grow up, I grew up learning how to be an archival historian. And that's a different proposition than learning how to read an archaeological report. And so I think that the training that we give both undergraduates and graduate students needs to change to accommodate allowing for people to truly work in more interdisciplinary ways. So
when you look at archaeological reports, I mean, presumably it must be a very different process to make sense of them and tell stories about them. Because one thing I notice in your work is, you do thematically and you kind of come out with interesting narratives, and archaeological reports are often, that's not, I mean, that's not what they're about really. I mean, they may kind of conclude on something, but they're very, very circumspect, and they're very careful about what they are claiming. So, how do you feel that historians, with the kind of training that you've had, kind of learn to read these documents and do things with them that are kind of useful and maybe different?
Right. Well, I mean, I think one of the things just getting back a little bit to why a lot of historians don't read much archaeology, I think it's because the archaeology report is a daunting animal that we aren't really trained to approach. But I think that, a lot of historians are pretty grumpy that archaeologists aren't writing history, which I'm not grumpy about at all. I think archaeologists are supposed to write archaeology, and that's what they do. And if we want history written out of that material evidence, we have to do it ourselves. So historians have to learn how to deal with the beast that is an archaeological report. And we think differently. We have different historiographies in our heads. We have different questions in our heads, and we write in the active voice, unlike archaeologists who write in the passive voice. And right there's a big change in what we're doing with the material, right? We're trying to, we're more focused, I think, this isn't completely fair, but I think historians in general are more focused on people. And I think archaeologists are more focused on places and things. And so if we can learn how to, to deal with the kinds of materials that archaeologists produce, I think we naturally do something quite different with it because of our training as historians.
So on sort of the issues that you write about, you make one point about, so the overwhelming documentation is about men from this period. Well, I mean, from the 5th century to, you could say, the 11th century.
Yeah.
And
well,
beyond.
Or to the 20th, maybe we could.
I defer to you on that. Yes, no, I wouldn't descend. But I mean, so there was a very recent, I think it was Mark Norris, I believe, who wrote a kind of, very accessible, very worthy history of Anglo Saxon, kind of England, and it was all about men. And he did recognise at the beginning, this is, because there's limited documentation. However, you make the powerful point that archaeologically, it seems that most material is about women. So I mean, so that kind of is really, that's a bit of a clash. How do you sort of manage that in writing the history? Do you basically have to say that the documentation is just purblind to this, or I mean, how do you kind of interpret that?
Well, I think, as we know, historian, the people who write histories are often more interested in themselves than they are anybody else. And the people who are writing texts in the early Middle Ages are by and large men. They're by and large ecclesiastical men, and they're by and large members of elite families. And so, of course, that's the world that they're going to present to us. I mean, they'll occasionally give us shout outs to high status women and the odd abbess, but they're not going to tell us very much about anybody else. But it's not just that they're just going to talk about men, but they only talk about elites. And so when I first started my Penguin, I wanted to put more women into history, but I really, really wanted to put more small farmers and peasants into history is what I want to do, because they're 90% of the population, whether men or women. And so the written sources we have don't deal with them at all. And so I wrote 2 books quite happily on, English elites in the 10th and 11th centuries. And I was very interested in them. I was very engaged in writing about them, but they were almost all men and they were all pretty elite. And I wanted to know what was underneath them. And so I decided that the only way I could find those people was by looking at archaeology. And I think that that's true, actually. I think
you found a richness. Yeah.
Yeah.
So one of the things you've obviously also found is interesting things about ethnicity, or how do we talk about ethnicity? Because in some of the archaeological material you look at, the kind of clothing and the jewelry people have, you show this sort of disconnect between what their symbolism is and might mean, and for instance DNA kind of evidence. Could you say a bit about that? I mean, because DNA a kind of evidence is obviously a very new thing, but it seems to be very startling what it shows, that kind of people can be dressed and look kind of like they're from somewhere else, but they're definitely, from their genetic record that you can see, not. So how revolutionary do you think that is, and how disruptive is it to the narratives we might have?
Well, I think a lot of people have been pushing back on the idea that if you look at the exterior of a person and how they dress, and then you cut them open, you're going to find exactly that same person on their inside, right? I think that for decades, there have been a lot of people, mostly archaeologists, pushing back on this notion that a particular brooch might give a clue to the actual biological identity of a person. And that we've long understood that people put on identities or claim identities, and they can do it in various ways: dress, hairstyle, slang, language, religion. And so I think for quite a while, people have been thinking about that, but I still think that there's a tendency to think that if you look at a cemetery and the women are wearing brooches on both shoulders, what you have is an Anglo Saxon cemetery, and the people buried in that cemetery are Anglo Saxon. And I think between the stable isotopes and the ancient DNA, which is a real work in progress, and it, see what everybody thinks 20 years from now, because it's a very fast moving field. And there've been a lot of kind of over promises and overstatements and a lot of refinement of techniques over the last 10 years. But I think that's really going to change the narrative. But it hasn't quite done it yet because we don't have enough evidence.
Where would you say things are now? Because I mean, in your books, or the most recent one, you refer to, you know, indigenous or the native peoples of Britain. Do you think that the DNA evidence is showing? I mean, I remember years ago reading something about, you know, it seemed very settled. You know, kind of sort of DNA evidence showed no great kind of influx of new people, but obviously that's become much more complicated. Where do you think things are now?
It has become more complicated, and it depends on the study. I think the study of the DNA of living populations in Britain is not going to get us anywhere. I think that what's going to get us someplace is the study of ancient DNA. But we need to have hundreds and hundreds of examples before we can make major claims about what's happening, I think. I mean, the problem with sort of looking at modern populations and comparing ancient DNA to modern DNA is that people have been coming into Britain since the Neolithic, and they've been coming in from the same places. So it's just really, you cannot tell if somebody's ancestors came over in the 5th century, or if they came over in the 8th century, or if they came over like my family, name of Fleming, right? If they came over in the 14th century, but they're all genetically, they all look pretty much the same. And so it's very difficult to tell what stage of the game you're in. So even though there does seem to be quite a large input of genetic material from Northwestern Europe, when did that happen? We don't, it's very hard to tell a timeline for that.
Why do you think, so this period, I mean, it's a kind of pretty obvious question, but it's an important one. I mean, why does this period matter? I mean, it seems to, I mean, is it just that there's not much known, or there's not much that's thought to be known about it, so people are intrigued? Or do you think it's really, really a significant period? I'm talking particularly about, you know, the kind of the 5th century to the 7th century, you know, that period, which is so sort of shadowy in a way, at least from the documentation. Why does that period matter?
Well, I mean, I think it matters for a bunch of reasons. I think every period matters, and every period should have history written about it. So, I mean, it matters in that way. But I mean, living in the world that we live in, right, where we're very dependent on the state and on objects that aren't produced by us, and we live in very, very complicated society in the same way that a lot of people lived in the 3rd and 4th centuries. And we're living in a period of pandemic, catastrophic climate difficulties. I think it's worth thinking about what happened, why big systems go away, and what happens to the people who are left behind, and thinking about things like resilience. So I think just in our own particular historical moment, I think it makes sense to look at this period. But that's not really, I mean, I really look at it because I'm curious about the people who live there. So I'm interested in it for its own sake, not so much for what it could do for us.
Yeah. And I mean, so, but I believe that you're kind of currently, from your out of office message anyway, you're currently researching Roman period, in particular Roman dogs, I believe.
Yeah.
I mean, the image that one has of the Roman period is it was just all kind of great. I mean, you know, it's sort of, after the kind of uprising with Boudicca in 60 AD, you know, then, yeah, it was all great. Everything was fantastic. And then round about 350, you know, started to go a bit ragged, but kind of was okay. And then suddenly everyone cleared off and they turned out the light, and in 410 or 49, that was it. Now, I presume that is a massive kind of pile of nonsense. And actually, it must have been a very complex period. So if you think of the 4th century and what you're researching at the moment, presumably that period also was one which intimated what was coming. There must have been a lot of fragmentation and a lot of kind of tensions. And this elite that you refer to, I think you said there's about 14,000, maybe 15,000 in this elite who were beholden to the Roman state as it exists in Britain, must have been aware that their world was changing. How would you describe that period? I mean, how do you conceptualize that period? As a sort of interim period, or kind of the end of days, or, you know, the beginning of something new?
I mean, I mean, it's interesting because I mean, we're not Romans, right? I mean, I think we are in many ways much more beholden to the medieval period than we are to the ancient world. And the reason for that is what happens in the late 4th, 5th, and 6th centuries. So the kind of world that we grew up in, and the world that was made, I think, more by medieval people than by ancient people. So, I mean, I guess that's what I would have to say about that. But you know, I think the Roman period is an interesting and important period in its own right. And one of the reasons I'm writing about Roman dogs as a historian is because the field of Roman Britain is almost entirely practiced by archaeologists, and it is almost 100% an archaeological field. And there are very few people who consider themselves British historians who write the history of Roman Britain. And I think this is a very bizarre state of affairs. And what it means is that British history actually begins in 450 or 500, or, you know, pick a date, sometime after, you know, the Romans left, as we like to say, which means that British history, which is a history of Britain, is conceptually thought to begin when the English arrive, which seems highly problematic. And it's all about the 19th century, and it's not about what actually happened. And I think we should be looking more at both the Roman period and the early Middle Ages together, so that we actually can figure out what was happening. So I think that the division between Roman and early medieval has obscured a lot of what's going on. And I think we kind of need to glue those periods back together again. And more of us trained as historians need to look back on the Roman period. Because it's not, I mean, I know this for a fact, that people who teach early medieval British history, or people who teach early medieval history on the continent as well, know much more about 4th century Syria and 4th century Egypt than they know about 4th century Britain. And that's because historians write on 4th century Syria and 4th century Egypt, but they don't write on 4th century Britain.
Mm. Well, that's, so, I mean, just a final couple of things. I mean, so the Kent Archaeological Society, predominantly our holdings, our kind of, you know, kind of artifacts, of which there are, you know, kind of 8,000 or 9,000, are overwhelmingly classified as early medieval to sort of mid-medieval. And at the moment are displayed in Maidstone Museum, which is where we're holding them, as that, you know, well, as Anglo Saxon. So we've got immediately to revise that, but we will be kind of reordering this. So, I mean, if you were kind of given, so we have some Roman artifacts, I suppose, by which I mean pre, you know, 5th century.
Yeah.
We have a lot of funerary and kind of jewelry and, you know, kind of other artifacts from the 5th, the 6th century onwards. So if we were to give this to you and say, look, how would you narrativize this? How would you display this? Seeing as a lot of it is about death and the treatment of the dead, how would you do that in ways which can be understood, but also informative for, you know, a 21st century audience?
I mean, I think what I would do is I would try to show how your early medieval holdings are related both to what comes after and what comes before, and talk about what may be related to older Roman populations and what may be related to incomers, because Kent gets a lot of newcomers. I mean, it's one of the places where there's a lot of immigrants coming in this period, unlike other places in England. So, but what I would try to do is not draw a hard line and say, oh, this is the Roman stuff and it doesn't have anything to do with the medieval stuff, but instead try to connect the two and see how there's not just continuity, but there's change, and there's not just change in population, but there's continuity in population as well. And I know a couple of the pots in your collection are related to some of the pots that I showed when I talked to your society, that look, they're from the 5th century, but there are things about them that look kind of Roman. And I think it would be interesting to kind of tease out story. And a place that's done a very nice job of that is at Hitchin, the local museum at Hitchin. And the one of the people there who used to be, he's the archaeologist for that part of Hertfordshire, and has done a lot of digging in that part of Hertfordshire, but it's also associated with the museum, has worked very hard to tell the story of the transition. And I think it's a real model for other local museums in their collections.
We will look closely at that then. We will look closely at that. Of course.
Yeah, so his name is Keith Fitzpatrick Matthews. I mean, and he's terrific. And there's a beautiful display case that actually kind of does all this work.
Do you think the British Museum does a good job of this in its sort of national holdings, or would you, if you were given that, would you say, okay, I want to reorder this completely and do it in a different way? It's
very ethnic. Its approach is very ethnic, or it's centered on great digs, which I can understand why a museum would want to do, like Sutton Hoo. But there's the Visigoth,
right.
container and the Anglo Saxon container, and it's a little 1970s conception of ethnicity for my taste.
That's interesting. So look, if we get this right, we'll definitely invite you to look around and to sort of.
I would, I'd love. Yeah, if I can ever get back to England, I would.
We hope that will happen soon. Very finally, I mean, just a sort of, not a personal question, but I mean, as I understand it, you studied in California and now you're in Boston. I mean, obviously, I get this all the time as I'm sort of dealing with China. And why am I? Why am I interested in China? Why? How did this sort of become such a sort of important part of your life? I mean, was there a particular reason or a particular moment, or is it just something that you kind of came across as you developed as an historian?
I mean, I think in part it's because the evidence matched the way my brain worked. So I think that I always liked the kind of evidence of the period, and I liked working with the evidence even as an undergraduate. But I think really it comes down to what it comes down to for so many people is I had a couple of really, really inspiring undergraduate teachers, and they made me want to do what they did. And it's just sort of dumb luck and the kind of connections that you make as you go through your education. And I think that's it. And I spent a very nice year at Westfield College at the University of London as an undergraduate, and it changed my life. I never looked back.
Excellent. Well, look, it's great for the field, and it's great for us that you didn't look back. And you're incredibly important, and sort of magnificent books have been hugely helpful in understanding a very kind of complex time and raising really important questions. So I'm really grateful that you've had this discussion with us, and look forward to inviting you to our museum when it's displays in the museum when they're redone. Thank you very much.
Are you actually open?
Well, no. So I'm sorry. I just